Buddha nature and the Tathāgatagarbha. What do these things mean and where do they come from in Buddhism? Buddha nature is this idea that all things, all beings, perhaps all things, are of the nature of a Buddha in some sense. Tathāgatagarbha is a very, very closely related idea. Garbha means womb. Tathāgata is another name for the Buddha. So basically it's that all things are a womb for the Buddha in the sense that all things, once again, we might say have a Buddha within them, are essentially Buddhas in some sense, or are of the nature to become Buddhas, depending on how this is interpreted. So in today's video, what I want to do is to look at some of the roots of these ideas in the early texts, and then turn to some later elaborations, that is to say, how did these things come to fruition, and a quick look at some controversies with these ideas. So first, early Buddhism. Now, it's important to stress that there is no really similar idea to Buddha nature or Tathāgatagarbha in early Buddhism. The point in early Buddhism, the aim, was to become an arahant, an enlightened person, an enlightened being. It was not to become a Buddha. Now, in early Buddhism, enlightenment, that is to say the enlightenment of the arahant, was not thought of as any different from the enlightenment of the Buddha, Shakyamuni, who was really the only Buddha who was known at the time. But we were not supposed to be becoming Shakyamuni. We're not supposed to be becoming Buddhas. That was not considered a goal in early Buddhism. In early Buddhism, of course, Shakyamuni was the teacher, so there was no thought of becoming the teacher. The teacher was teaching us how to become enlightened. However, all that said, there were indeed a couple of strands in early Buddhism that became very important in the later development of Buddha nature. The first and perhaps most important of these was the idea of the luminous mind. In early Buddhism, in early texts, we read, "This mind is luminous, but it is defiled by adventitious defilements or corrupted by passing corruptions," depending on how we translate that phrase. Now, taken on its face, this short passage seems to indicate the idea of a kind of essential or original mind, a mind that is somehow more ontologically important than the corruptions that come and go. That is, this original mind that we have is pure, is radiant in a sense, and therefore it is perhaps permanent, it is perhaps everlasting, that it doesn't change. However, such a view that the mind is originally or naturally pure, that it has a sort of an essence to it, is, we have to say, at odds with the entirety, basically, of early Buddhist Dharma, in which all things are always in a condition of flux and change, including the mind. As the scholar Bhikkhu Analayo put it with respect to the early texts, there seems little scope to postulate that the mind is naturally pure. Instead, one might even say that it is naturally defiled. That is to say, that in early Buddhism, we're understood to have been in a beginningless round of rebirths, rebirths that went back forever. And the reason that we have been reborn so many times on a traditional early Buddhist understanding is because of this beginningless defilement of the mind, this beginningless ignorance in which we are sunk. And so to that extent, in early Buddhism, the mind can be thought of as kind of originally defiled in some sense. So then, what did this idea of the luminous mind mean in early Buddhism? I did a video about it a while back, which I'll leave down below in the notes, but Bhikkhu Analayo argues, following several other scholars, that this idea of the luminous mind reflects the experience of deep samadhi, that is to say, of deep meditative absorption, in which the mind becomes more malleable, more capable of attaining the insight necessary for enlightenment. And this idea of luminosity seems to come from the metaphor of hammering gold, of working gold. We take gold, we heat it up, and then we hammer at it, in order to remove the impurities from the gold and leave it in a purer state in which the gold becomes more workable, more malleable, more easily fashioned into things that we might want to fashion gold into. In the same way, the mind becomes more malleable and workable as we reach these deep states of meditative absorption. That is to say that this idea of luminosity is an idea of a workable mind. It's not the idea of the enlightened mind. The enlightened mind comes later, once this workable mind has been put to the work of attaining the insight necessary for enlightenment. The second kind of passage that becomes important with the development of the idea of Buddha nature is that there are a couple of places in the early texts where the Buddha identifies himself with the teaching. He identifies himself with the Dharma. There's one sutta where the Buddha is confronted by a very ill monastic named Vakali, and Vakali is on his deathbed, and the Buddha asks Vakali if he has any regrets, and Vakali says he does. He has the regret of not having seen the Buddha in person enough over his lifetime. Now his life is coming to an end, and he really has not spent very much time in the Buddha's presence. When the Buddha hears this, the Buddha responds thusly. He says, "Enough, Vakali. Why would you want to see this rotten body? One who sees the Dharma sees me. One who sees me sees the Dharma. Seeing the Dharma, you see me. Seeing me, you see the Dharma." In other words, the importance of the Buddha as a person, as a being, as somebody with a rotten body, as he says, is that he is a mouthpiece for the Dharma. And the importance of him as a person is as this mouthpiece for the Dharma. When you see him, his importance is in his teaching. When you see the teaching, you're seeing him as its proponent, if you like. Elsewhere, in one place in the early texts, the Buddha describes himself as the Dharma body, or Dhammakaya. This in Sanskrit becomes Dharmakaya, which becomes a very, very important idea in the notion of Buddha nature, which we'll get to in a moment. However, in early Buddhism, this idea of Dhammakaya, or Dharma body, is very obscure. It's what they call, the technical term is a hapax legomenon. That is to say, it is a singular word, and it's only used once in the early texts and never explained. It may simply mean, as I said before, that the Buddha was the proponent of the Dharma. He was the person who gave it reality by expressing it for the first time, at least in known history. It may also be, as the scholar Bhikkhu Sujato says, that the Buddha embodies the qualities of the Dharma to the highest degree, and so therefore he is the Dharma body. Nevertheless, concepts such as these, that when you see the Buddha, or I should say when you see the Dharma, you see the Buddha, or the idea being that the Buddha is the Dharma body, these suggest, to some extent, that the Buddha essentially survived his own physical death. That the Buddha can be identified with the Dharma, the Buddha can be identified with the teaching, the Buddha can be identified with the way things are, which is another way to understand Dharma. The Dharma is simply the expression of the way things are. And so therefore, perhaps the Buddha did not die with his physical death, but continues on in the personage of the Dharma, in the personage of this Dharma body. So now let's turn to some later developments. First, quickly, let's look at some issues with the Lotus Sutra, which was composed, basically put together around the 1st century of the Common Era. In the Lotus Sutra, the Buddha does not appear literally as somebody who is immortal in the sense that Buddha nature is essentially immortal, but rather the Buddha is said to have been born as a real human, immeasurable, limitless hundreds of thousands of myriads of kotis of nayutas of kalpas ago. Now that's quite a mouthful, but basically it means he was born at a particular time and place. It just happens to have been a hugely long time ago. Similarly, the Lotus Sutra says that the lifespan of Buddhas is immeasurable, it's huge, it's enormous. However, the Buddha himself does have, it seems, a finite lifespan, one that is not yet expired. It is twice as great as the number previously mentioned, is what the Lotus Sutra says. So, at least from the point of view of the Lotus Sutra, the Buddha, as a semi-deified or deified figure, is nevertheless mortal. He's somebody who was born at a particular time and place, although a hugely long time ago, became enlightened a hugely long time ago, and will pass away a hugely long time from now, however, at some point. That is to say, another way of saying this, is that in the Lotus Sutra we do not find the idea of Buddha nature or the Tathāgatagarbha explicitly said. It seems to have been a later development. So then, when did these ideas arise? Well, they seem to have arisen in the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era, a little after at least the earliest core of the Lotus Sutra. They seem to have arisen in texts such as the Mahāyāna Mahaparinirvana Sutra from the 2nd century. That is, it's the Mahaparinirvana Sutra that comes from the Mahāyāna tradition, not the one from the early tradition. Also, from the 3rd century Tathāgatagarbha Sutra, where we get the first real elaboration of the Tathāgatagarbha, this womb of the Tathāgata expressed in that phrase, or that word, Tathāgatagarbha. Now, these texts posited, at least apparently, an eternal, imperishable, pure self that resides within all of us, within all beings, which is of the nature of the Buddha. Sometimes this being is identified with the Dharmakaya, this Dharma body that we discussed, that I mentioned earlier, as expressed in one early text. This Dharma body, this Dharmakaya, is this kind of Buddha nature. This concept of Buddha nature may have played a key role in the development of the Mahāyāna, and this is a speculation of mine, given the way the early Mahāyāna developed. It developed in a way to make the goal very, very exalted. And it became so exalted that it became, in a sense, difficult to understand how we could ever achieve it. So this concept of Buddha nature makes the achievement of the goal of the Mahāyāna more understandable, more comprehensible. So one of the hallmarks of the development of the early Mahāyāna, indeed the later some of the later texts of the early material as well, is this notion of hagiography, this notion of, as I've termed it, creeping docetism, that the Buddha himself became understood less as an ordinary human being and more as a kind of a god, a deified figure, with truly astounding supernatural abilities and powers, to the extent that it was difficult, I think, for many people probably to understand how they could pursue any sort of practice that would lead them to those kinds of ends, of true omniscience and so on. How could we possibly attain such ends ourselves and become Buddhas as the goal of the Mahāyāna was? The goal of the Mahāyāna changed from one of attaining arahantship or enlightenment to one of attaining complete and pure Buddhahood. How can we become Buddhas if becoming Buddhas essentially involves becoming a kind of a god? Well, we could, it becomes understandable, if in fact all of us retain within ourselves this essence of Buddhahood, this essence of a Buddha, that we are essentially Buddhas, that we are at least potentially Buddhas, that we always have been and always will be, and moreover, that the essence of our ignorance is that we are ignorant of the fact that we are actually Buddhas. If we are, in fact, of the same nature as a Buddha, which is what the concept of Buddha nature implies, then our practice becomes much, at least apparently, somewhat simpler. It's not an enormous long practice, but it's one that's conceivable and achievable. It's one of simply uncovering these kinds of passing defilements that have covered over this original mind, this pure mind, this luminous mind, which is the Buddha mind. There was, however, a major controversy with this concept of Buddha nature. That is to say, it appears, on its surface anyhow, to overturn the broadest of the three marks of existence. That is, it appears to be in contradiction to the claim from early Buddhism that all dharmas are non-self. As the scholar Michael Zimmerman has argued, the existence of an eternal, imperishable self, that is, Buddhahood, is definitely the basic point of the Tathāgatagarbha Sutra. And scholar Paul Williams notes of the Mahāyāna Mahaparinirvana Sutra something very similar. One thing anyway is clear. The Mahaparinirvana Sutra teaches a really existing, permanent element in sentient beings. It is this element which enables sentient beings to become Buddhas. Now, such views as these would have been anathema to many even Mahāyāna Buddhists of the time, particularly those from what later became termed the Madhyamaka school, that viewed all dharmas as inherently shunya, or empty. This notion of shunyata, of emptiness, is one that derived from perhaps the 1st century BCE Prajnaparamita sutras, the sutras on the perfection of wisdom. The idea was then given its full understanding, its elaborated understanding by the 2nd century of the Common Era, great Buddhist philosopher Nagarjuna. This notion of shunyata took the early Buddhist notion of non-self and basically expanded it into all dharmas and all things and all concepts everywhere, that they were all empty of any essential permanent nature. They were all empty. That is to say, this shunyata became a universalistic concept. The idea is way too big to get into here, but perhaps you'll be familiar with it in the discussions of emptiness that you will hear in many contemporary Buddhist discourses. This idea, again, that all things are empty of permanent existence, all things are empty of essence. Now, of course, the controversy here is this notion of emptiness, of shunyata, seems to conflict with the ideas in Buddha nature, in the Tathāgatagarbha. This idea that nothing has an essence seems to conflict with the idea that all things are of the essence of the Buddha, or of a Buddha. Now, there was a relatively straightforward way to solve this apparent conflict or contradiction or a problem within Buddhism, at least for some. That is, it was to identify Buddha nature with emptiness. To say that when we discuss Buddha nature or the Tathāgatagarbha, what we're really talking about is emptiness, is non-self. That the true Buddha nature is the nature of non-self, is the nature of the lack of any nature, the nature of the lack of any essence. This is sort of a paradoxical way to solve the problem, but it is at least one potential solution for some. This is the idea, we might say in Michael Zimmerman's words, that this eternal, imperishable self is, in fact, non-self. Again, a bit of a strange kind of solution, but one that works for some. Now, in particular, this is the solution that we find in Tsongkhapa's interpretation of Buddha nature. Tsongkhapa, a very, very important medieval philosopher and Buddhist thinker in the Tibetan tradition, and indeed the founder of the Gelug school in Tibet, the Gelug school being the school to which the Dalai Lama himself is a member. That is, we might say that Tsongkhapa took the Madhyamaka interpretation as the correct one. However, having said that, we should not lose sight of the fact that other Buddhists over the millennia, over the centuries and millennia, have not necessarily agreed with the Madhyamaka approach. Other Buddhists, some Buddhists, take the Madhyamaka approach as too nihilistic, as denying too much. And for them, the correct interpretation of Buddha nature, of Tathāgatagarbha, is not to understand it as simply emptiness in the way that the Madhyamikas or Tsongkhapa might say, but rather it should be interpreted as a very real essence, a very real consciousness that underlies all phenomena. For example, the Tibetan Jonang school, which holds the view known as Shentong. This is the view that this underlying essence is free of other nature. It is not of the nature of other, to have other, but it is not free of self-nature. It has self-nature. It has self-nature, but not other nature. This is obviously too big of an issue to get into in this video, but the point is that there are those other Buddhists who disagree with the Madhyamika view and hold that this Buddha nature, it does have its own self-nature. It is a really existing thing that underlies phenomena. This school in Tibet was actually subject to suppression by the dominant Geluk school. So it was held to be, we might say, somewhat heretical as a Buddhist view, and so had to put up with repression. Yes, indeed, repression does at times happen in Buddhism as well. So what is the upshot here? Well, the upshot here is that in the early tradition, there was no real concept of Buddha nature per se. Instead, there was the idea that we should become arahants. Now, in the early tradition, of course, it was possible to become a Buddha. That was not outside the realm of possibility. However, there were so vanishingly few Buddhas, understood at least again from the early tradition, that it would have been virtually impossible to become one. And that was not understood to be the goal of practice. The goal of practice was simply to eliminate greed, hatred, and delusion, to become enlightened, and to escape, therefore, the round of rebirths. In order to do this, one of the goals of practice was to attain this kind of luminous mind that one gained in certain kinds of deep samadhi, or deep concentration. This luminous mind would then allow the mind to become more malleable, more easily worked, in ways that would help us attain enlightenment through insight into the characteristics of reality. The Buddha himself was identified with the Dharma because he was its discoverer, he was its perhaps major exponent, and his practice was arguably the purest. In later Buddhism, the Buddha became somewhat deified. His abilities became much grander, much greater than human, greater in ways that it became difficult to understand how we could possibly achieve those ends, the end of becoming a Buddha. However, if we understand the mind to be inherently, originally, permanently luminous, permanently expressing of the nature of a Buddha, then that goal doesn't seem so far at all. The only thing we have to overcome in our ignorance is seeing this luminous Buddha mind directly for ourselves and dispelling these passing defilements. Now, if you want to learn more about the concept of emptiness, which I've touched on quite a bit at the later part of this video, I'll leave a video about the development of that concept up here on the screen where you can learn more. Thanks so much. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider taking a look at my Patreon page, which is linked up here on the screen and down below in the notes, and see if you want to help support the channel. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next video. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.